I just remember this so clearly, sitting in one of those little preschool chairs, and they come in, they're like, well, and I could instantly tell I was about to get some bad news. But I didn't have any idea how bad the news was going to be. So I heard we believe, and the lady who administered the test had worked with other children in the autistic spectrum, and she said, I believe your son's autistic. Well, I just kind of started spinning and listened to the recommendations, and the prognosis from this expert was that he was autistic and in the not in the high functioning area of autism, in the middle range, probably wouldn't go to school. I'm hearing all this at once, so not sure that he would ever live independently. The prognosis for his life was grim at best. So today I will be talking about my personal experience as a mom who has raised a child in the autistic spectrum. I'm going to be sharing some of the most resonating lessons I have learned through my journey. My intention today is to give you my background and how I got to this point of hosting the very first Mother's Guide through autism. So, a little bit more about the inspiration behind this podcast. So, together, Joseph and I are offering mothers of autistic children. We really just want to offer you all hope for the future. We want to share our journey in hopes that you will be inspired and that you will feel like your child will be living a life in their own purpose, right? That they're an individual, that they have their own hopes and dreams, and that's really what we want to do here. You know, I think back 25 years ago when Joseph was 2 and beginning some of the signs that perhaps something just wasn't quite right in his child development. I remember that fear in the pit of my stomach. And, you know, if I would have had someone like Joseph and myself to be able to sit here and tell you it's going to be okay, that would have been very valuable. I really believe that I would have been a much happier mom, a much happier wife, sister, daughter, and friend. I spent a lot of my time in fear, in a lot of grief, as I'm sure most of you are going through. It's a scary ride, but the message here is that you're going to be okay. Your child's gonna thrive. Your child has their own hopes and dreams, and so that's what we're going to be talking about. But before we get into some of the things that I want to talk to you about today, for my own personal experience, I would just want to give you a little bit of my background. I have been an educator for over 30 years. I began in public school as an elementary teacher. I taught in the school system for 20 years, and I've taught everything from preschool to seniors in high school. I have a bachelor's degree in elementary education. And then I stayed home for 10 years with both of my sons, which that was a choice that my husband and I made. That was just something that we knew that was important to us. So that was just our choice, and we were fortunate enough for me to get to stay home. While I was at home, though, those 10 years, I was a fitness instructor. I became an expert advocate for my son, Joseph, who was diagnosed within the autistic spectrum. He was around 3.5. I started the first support group for parents, grandparents, and educators in our area of Mountain Home, Arkansas. So in this rural setting, there were really no resources at that time. And this was probably 1995. This search for resources and help started with us. So I did that. And then I was also raising my typical developed son, Jacob. When Jacob was a year old, I decided that I would go back to school and get my master's degree in educational leadership. Once Jacob started kindergarten, I decided I would go back to teaching, and I fell in love with an educational reform called Career Academies. And so I became the director of that program, loved it, did that work for 15 years. And then I decided that I would like to become a life coach. So I ended my career in public education and I became a Martha Beck certified life coach. And I also started my own business in 2016, BMV Life Coach. So that's now how I'm teaching through love. It's just a different venue, but I continue to teach. I continue to offer love and support, once to my students and now to anyone who listens. So that's a little bit about me. So working with moms who have children in the spectrum has really been my main passion for the past 25 years. I mean, as soon as I knew Joseph was going to be living with this lifelong disability, I just dug my heels in and I didn't look up. It became my life. I decided that while I was digging my heels in and trying to search for all these resources, which I'm going to share in this episode and the upcoming episodes of this podcast, I wanted to share it. I wanted to help other children, other teachers, other parents, grandparents, anyone who was searching that I came in contact with, what worked and didn't work for Joseph. So that passion has been with me. And so really that's what we're doing here. Joseph and I are going to be sharing what has worked and hasn't worked, our grief, some of our struggles, our challenges, and how we get to the other side in this world, right? The other thing I wanted to let others know is really how to improve speech, expressive language, fine motor skills, large motor skills, how to interact socially with others, but mostly how to live a life with purpose. So those are some of the intentions and passions behind this work. And so I am going to now share with you guys a little bit about this journey, as I told you we would be talking about in this podcast. And this name of the podcast, and hopefully all of you out there listening will be inspired by this and you'll be able to relate to it. It doesn't matter where you're at on this journey of autism. If you just first, your child's been diagnosed, perhaps you're not sure if you need to get a diagnosis, or maybe your autistic child is, middle school, junior high, high school, and transitioning into an adult life with autism. Really doesn't matter where you're at. This will inspire you. So, as the beginning creation of this podcast came, I went to the source. I went to one of the best life teachers that I've had in my life, and that's my son Joseph. So I asked him, I wanted to know, Joseph, how would you describe me, your mom, through our journey together living with autism? Joseph is famous for his one-liners that will blow you away. It doesn't take a lot of words, but he will get to your heart in like 2 seconds. So I asked him the question, and he stood there and he pondered, and then he said, right now I'm blank. And I have learned over these years not to take anything personal. And so I said, okay, well, that's cool. Well, if something comes up for you, will you let me know? And then within a few seconds later, he said, well, I picture you as an old man on top of a mountain with a gray, long beard, and you're stroking your beard. I said, oh, cool. So, wisdom, a wise old man. And so I started thinking about that. I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Well, he paused again and he said, no. He said, no, it's more like your tour guide. You're my tour guide. I said, of life? And he said, yeah, you're my tour guide of life. And boy, that resonated with me. I thought, oh, wow, yeah, that is what an advocate is. That is what I have done. I have been his guide. I've tried to show him in any way possible how to get through his life. Because, I'm the mom and I can share my experiences about what it's like to be the mom of a child in the autistic spectrum. But wow, he's the one living it, right? He's the source. He's the one who can share so much with us, thankfully, to help us be the moms, the guides of life through autism. So that is how A Mother's Guide to Autism came to be. And it truly has inspired me. I mean, I've been inspired, but it just really resonated and shot something through me to make this podcast even more relevant. And I'm being pulled even more to do this work. So there's that. I hope you're feeling it and resonating with that story of how we got here. So I want to now take you to the beginning, 1992. And my son, Joseph, is born, and his dad and I couldn't be more overjoyed. I was one of those, probably, I don't know, one of those moms that might get on other people's nerves because I documented everything, every stage of development that my son showed. I wrote down. I had one of those yearly calendars and I jotted down daily what I saw in his development. And I absolutely loved being a mom. That still to this day for both of my sons is my highest honor. To be their mom. And so with that, I noticed quickly through his first year of life that, wow, I have a very smart child, possibly a genius. His vocabulary at 6 months, he had 60 words, 60-word vocabulary, and a few bilingual words since my parents are German. I was raised bilingual. And so he was exposed to that and had those 60-word vocabulary in German. And so it was really pretty cool how fast he was developing. He walked really early. He was well on his way, moving with large motor skills, walking well, turning at 9 months, which is pretty early. And he also could put puzzles together. He loved painting. His fine motor skills were really advanced as well. So basically, I had this extremely advanced child who really was looking more and more every day like a genius. And so I was just like, wow, this is so cool. Documented everything. His first birthday, I look back at that normal. Everything is just great. And then after his first birthday, things started slowing down. Those 60 words did not become sentences. I noticed him being sensitive to sound. He would cover his ears a lot. He didn't like going to certain places out in public. He became very fearful of many, many things in his surroundings. He was also super obsessed with videos. He loved the videos that had the words, the songs, the music that were with the videos. And he had shared with me that he actually began to understand and be able to read words when he was in his first year, moving into his second year. So I was like, what? His speech was echolalic. He used videos to communicate with me. We called it video talk. He did that a lot. He started, we had carpet back then, and he would write in the carpet F in capital .H.E, which was a logo he saw on some of his favorite videos from Family Home Entertainment. He would also sit in his high chair, and he loved to paint and draw and carve soap. Let him carve soap with a little plastic knife, and he made these fabulous 3D elephants, which he was also obsessed with at that time. And his vision, he would point and he would draw and he would paint with peripheral vision, which, of course, at the time, just watching him, it was just so interesting, and how he held his pencil and his paintbrush with those fine motor skill delays. But what he created with it was just phenomenal. Another things that I noticed was I thought, okay, I need to get him out and socialize. He did have two cousins, one older and one slightly younger than him, but I just noticed at family gatherings he wasn't really interested in interacting with them. He liked to play and watch videos by himself. So I would take him to the park, and other kids would be there, and rather than playing with them, he pretty much would run from them. He didn't understand. He didn't know how to interact with them, nor did he want to. I'll never forget this day. It was just one of those times where you have a knowingness that you just know. And my husband and I were sitting in the living room. I just looked at my husband, and Joseph was writing FHE in the carpet again. And I said, I remember in some of my early childhood classes in college, this thing called autism. Because at that time, the only reference to autism was Rain Man, and he certainly didn't display any of those characteristics. I mean, none of them. And I looked at my husband, I said, and he asked me a little bit about it, and I kind of told him. And we looked at each other. We had this moment in time where our eyes locked, and I know we both knew. And then we sat there for a few moments, and then we looked at each other again, and then we're like, nah, couldn't be. Doesn't add up. He's just really smart, right? So although you have that level of knowingness, denial is very common. I really hope some of the things that we're going to talk about in later episodes as a mom is letting go of some of the guilt, and I wish I would have done this, and I wish I would have known that. And that's going to be some of the work that I do on these podcasts, and relieving some of that for you moms out there. Denial is just part of it. It's part of the journey. And so we went on. Then we decided we would enroll him. He was around 3 years old, and we felt very strongly that we needed to get him around other kids, right? Maybe that was the issue. So I enrolled him in a daycare just for 3 days a week, just a few hours, just to socialize and get used to being around other children his age. And that was one of the hardest moments that I had. I dropped him off. It was a preschool that I worked at while I was in college, so I felt very comfortable with him, leaving him there, except when I drove away and I looked at him in the playground through the fence and he stood there. He just stood there. And I cried all the way home because I thought, oh my gosh, I just left my son out there and he has no idea what to do. So the journey continues, and I get a phone call from the preschool director, and she says, we'd like to test your son for his speech delays, his expressive language. And I'm like, yeah, well, sure. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So my husband and I agree, and he's tested, and I get called in. And I just remember this so clearly, sitting in one of those little preschool chairs, and they come in, they're like, well, and I could instantly tell I was about to get some bad news. But I didn't have any idea how bad the news was going to be. So I heard we believe, and the lady who administered the test had worked with other children in the autistic spectrum, and she said, I believe your son's autistic. Well, I don't know. I couldn't absorb it because I couldn't understand. It was really, I believe, a moment of shock. And I just sat there. I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, I believe your son's autistic. I've worked with other autistic kids, and we recommend that you go have him tested. Well, I just kind of started spinning and listened to the recommendations, and the prognosis from this expert was that he was autistic and not in the high functioning area of autism, in the middle range. Probably wouldn't go to school. I'm hearing all this at once, so not sure that he would ever live independently. Maybe, I went into like options. I mean, this is like overwhelming just to hear the word autism. And again, this was back in the day and I'm in a rural area where autism was related to the Rain Man, and really the prognosis for his life was grim at best. Oh, I don't know. I left my body. Somehow I drove home, called my husband. He came home right away, went and got my son, and the grieving began. And then denial set in again, believe it or not. Not to the degree of there's no way, but to the degree of I'm not going to accept what I just heard. So we started the list. We took him to an audiologist to make sure his hearing was intact. We took him to our pediatrician. He told me that I might want to read to my son to improve his speech, which amused me because really Joseph was pretty well looking at books and putting puzzles together and reading on his own. And I have been first grade teacher, read to my son nonstop. So again, not finding support or help. And so I started turning to my educator friends who came over. They were very positive, offered hope. My sister-in-law was a nurse, and she, at the time, lived in Oklahoma. And I had heard at that time that if I went to any group program for diagnosis at that time, that they were set up in teams at the Children's Hospital, that I may or may not get an accurate diagnosis. So she recommended a lady that she networked and found this this doctor, this psychologist who had been working in diagnosing children with autism for the past 20 years. So we opted for that. We went to Oklahoma. We went and met with her. Joseph was 3.5 at the time, and she diagnosed him with pervasive developmental disorder, which is at the tip of the highest functioning area of autism. And then my husband and I discovered that Joseph might also be in an area on the spectrum of autism with hyperlexia, because he recognized words and we believed that he was reading. Actually, a close friend of ours said, I think Joseph can read. And we're like, what? He was 1.5 at the time. So Joseph being able to read and comprehend his reading, he was never formally diagnosed with hyperlexia, but that is the research that was there at the time. And it was a tool instantly that we began to use and used heavily with social stories and helping Joseph's classroom teachers work with him. So that was a time when things just weren't, the support, the help, the resources were very limited. In the upcoming episodes, I'm going to share with you some of the therapies that I personally did with Joseph at home, some of the things that we discovered that worked and didn't work. We're going to be offering you all kinds of support, resources, and hope. I mean, that's the message here. If you're listening to this and you can relate to just some of these initial things at the beginning of this journey that are really hitting home with you, you're going to love the upcoming podcasts that we're going to share. So, some self-care, dealing with grief, stress. We're also going to have professional guests on some of our upcoming episodes that will offer you some great tools to become the expert advocate for your child, which I'll be talking about more in future podcasts too. I just want to remind you, you're the expert. You know your child. You may get recommendations from professionals that don't feel right to you. Go to that inner place. Mom's knowingness, I believe, is the strongest. And when they told me my son would not be able to go to a regular classroom, that he would be isolated, it didn't make any sense to me. Inclusion was not around at that time. In 1997, it was just beginning, and I was a huge advocate of it, and I got a lot of negative comments, responses, and treatment as a result of that, which I'll talk about more in upcoming episodes when we hit some of the part of the journey where Joseph does go to school. And by the way, he does go to a regular classroom, and how I worked with the school and some great tips to help you work with your school as your child's advocate. So those are important episodes coming up. Also, I'm really excited that Joseph is working, that we're a team now, and he is going to, in fact, be your guest for episode 2 of A Mother's Guide Through Autism. And I'm going to interview Joseph and just let him talk about his experience on this journey through autism, his points of view. After all, he's the one who's living with autism, and he's able to articulate and give us such great insight on how to be an advocate as a mother's guide. My son, who was echolalic, not much expressive language at all, not able to answer yes or no questions until he was 5, is now on one of our local radio stations. So If nothing else, and you tuned into this one, we want to leave you inspired. If, in fact, you enjoyed this podcast, we really hope that you will subscribe, review, and also share it on social media. I love you, moms out there. And the message here is it's going to be okay.